Parashat Shemot, Dikduk u'Masoret HaMikra, Parashat Shemot Gimel. There are several words in this parasha which are kind of unique and require explanation and discussion. The first one in Pasuk Yud Aleph, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayivin Arei Meskenot leFaro et Pitom veRamses. Ramses is a unique word. It's only mentioned once in the whole Torah. The Ben Ezra writes the following: Bepathu ta'ayin ve'enenu makom Yisrael. The vocalization, the nekudot under this particular word, under the ayin, there is a patah. And it is, he also writes, because of that, enenu makom Yisrael. It's not an area. It was one of the cities that were built for the Mitzrim, as Arei Meskenot, and it was not an area where any Israel lived. In contrast to that, there is another word very similar, used 4 times in the Torah, and it's pronounced, it's written and pronounced Ra'meses. Under the Ayin is a Sheva, and under the Mem is a Sheva. The first place that it's mentioned is in Parashat Bereshit, in Parashat Vahi, in Bereshit, Perek Mem Zayin, Pasuk Yud Aleph. And there, Rashi writes, Me'eretz Goshen hu. The particular area, the Mahoz, the area that in Eretz Goshen, that the Jews settled, the Yehudim settled at the time, Yaakov Banav, was called Ra'meses. And the pronunciation is Ra'meses. Under the Ayin, there's a Sheva. Under the Mem, there's another Sheva. The first Sheva is Sheva Nah, so it is silent. The second Sheva under the Mem is Sheva Nah, so it's heard and it's vocalized. In contrast to Ra'amses, where you have a Patah under the Ayin and a Sheva Nah under the Mem. The second place where it's mentioned is in Shemot Parashat Bo, and it is Perek Yud Bet, Pasuk Lamed Vav. The third and fourth places where it's mentioned are in Parashat Mas'eh, in Bamidbar, and they are Bamidbar, Lamed Gimal, and Bamidbar, Lamed Gimal, He. So the word Ra'meses, the place where the Yehudim lived, is mentioned 4 times in the Torah, but Ra'amses, in contrast, is only mentioned once, right here in Shemot, the Parashat Shemot, and it is, the way Ibn Ezra writes it, Enenu makom Israel. It's not an area where the Jews lived. It was built for the Egyptian kings to bury their dead, supposedly, where the pyramids were, maybe. That was the kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing that we can learn from the word Ra'meses, where you have 2 Shevas, are the rules for when you have 2 Shevas in a word. First, it can happen presumably, potentially, you could have it at the beginning of the word, but it really never happens. If ever that will be the case, the first Sheva is changed. For example, you can have the name Zevulun, as we have now, and if you want to write Ve-Zevulun and Zevulun, we don't say Ve-Zevulun, we say, as I said, as I mentioned in the first section, Uzvulun. You put an Aleph in the sound, you put an Aleph before the Zayin, and it becomes Uzvulun, a Shuruk, and a Sheva. Never will you find in the Torah 2 Shevas, one after another, in the beginning of a word. In the middle of the word, yes. As example, Ra'meses. And when you have 2 Shevas, the rule is when you have 2 Shevas in the middle of a word, the first one is always Sheva Nah. It's silent and not heard. The second one is vocalized, Sheva Nah. So you hear it. So therefore, the word Ra'meses, you don't hear the Sheva under the Ayin, but you do hear the Sheva under the Mem. There is another situation where you can have two Shevas at the end of a word. For example, in the word in Bamidbar, Kaf Aleph Aleph, Vayishp Mimenu Shevi. The word Vayishp has 2 Shevas at the end of the word, under the Shin and under the Bet. Both of them, the rule is that both of them, they're pronounced as, they are designated as Sheva Nah. They are not heard at all. All you hear is the sound of the letter without any tenuah, without any nikud underneath it. So again, the way you pronounce it at the end of the word, tu shevas vayishp mimenu shevi. And in contrast, in the middle of the word, your first one's nah, the second one is nah, ra meseis, and the beginning of the word never happens. So if you're going to add a sheva in the beginning of a word to a word which starts with a sheva, it's always changed, for example, to a shuruk, as we mentioned. Now, the sheva itself is not considered a vowel. It is much less in the vocalization of a vowel. For example, in the long vowels, we have kamatz, sereh, shuruk, hirik gadol, and that's it. And then in the short vowels, you have the patah, in contrast, the patah, the segol, the hirik katan, and the kubutz. But when you have a sheva after a long vowel, it automatically becomes a sheva nah. It's pronounced, and you can hear it, it's vocalized, and it's pronounced to the point where you can actually vocalize it and hear it. If you have a sheva after a tenorah ketana, like a patah, or a segol, or a hirik katan, in that case, the sheva, hirik katan, in fact, you don't, but sometimes you'll find it, and a kubutz, in that case, it becomes a sheva nah, and you do not hear it, it's silent after tenorah ketana. That's the basic rule to distinguish between a sheva nah and a sheva na. Now there's a word in this parasha which is interesting and unique that has the incorporation of what I've talked about before, but in a unique way. It also has the element of a dagesh coming into it. So it's Shemot Perek Bet, and it is Pasuk Perek Bet, Pasuk Gimal. And over there it says, Velo Yachela Od Hatsefino. And we'll stop at this word, Hatsefino. It's a very different, unique word. There, actually, the word should not be Hasefino, but it should be Hatspino, according to the way the Ibn Ezra writes it out. After a patah, usually the sheva afterwards is the sheva nah, so it should be Hats, as if you don't hear the pronunciation of the sheva, and then the pe afterwards is not a dagesh. You don't have a dagesh in it because, you do have a dagesh in it because it's the sheva, it's a dagesh kal with one of the letters beged kefet, bet gimal daled, kefet, kaf, pe, tav, any one of those letters that comes after a syllable which has a short vowel, like a tenorah ketana followed by a sheva nah, it automatically will have a dagesh. So the word should really be hatspino, but it's not. It's pronounced here hatsefino. Why? The Ben Ezra and the Minhachai and others indicate that this is there as tiferet hakeri'ah, or the way the Ibn Ezra uses the term ledaber bam sahut. So it is the eloquence and the beautification of the language that causes the tzadi to have a dagesh. It shouldn't have a dagesh, but it does. So therefore, it's pronounced hatsefino. The sheva underneath is now converted from hatspino, which be sheva nah, it's converted to a sheva nah, because the dagesh in the letter automatically converts the sheva underneath it to a sheva nah. So it's vocalized and it's pronounced. And the dagesh that usually comes in the pei from beged kefet after a sheva nah is now gone, removed, because it's not a sheva nah anymore. It's a sheva nah. So you say hatsefino. It's what's called in the language of the Masorah rafeh. It's weak. It's not. There's no dagesh. It's not emphasized. So there's no hadgasha at all. So instead of Hatzpinot, which it should have been, it is pronounced Hatzefinot. This is a unique category as to where sometimes a sheva becomes a shevana because of the usage or the term letiferet hakeriah. That normally, according to the dikduk, it should not be, but it is that way in order to beautify and make the lashon, the language and the sound of reading the Sefer Torah more eloquent. There are other cases such as this. In Parashat Vayhi, we have two of them specifically. In Bereshit Mem Tet Yud Zayin, the words are Hanoshech Ekevesus. Normally, the word would be Ekve, but there's a dagesh in the kuf, so that the kuf, the sheva under the kuf, is not ekveh, it's not a shevanah any longer, it becomes a shevanah lehadgasha, for emphasis, ekevesus, and it's for beautification of the pronunciation of the language. The second one you find in the same parasha, velo yikehat amim, pasuk perek memtet, pasuk yod. There, it should be yikat, as a shevanah under the kuf, without a dagesh. Instead, the dagesh is inserted in the Torah, according to the Masoret, in order to beautify and make the pronunciation of the words more eloquent, and the keriah more eloquent, letiferet hakeriah, so it's pronounced velo yikehat amim. The sheva under the kof becomes a sheva na. In contrast to the one we said before, hanoshech ekevesus, there is a case with the same word, ekveh, that is in Shir Shirim, and it's rafeh, be'ekveh hatzon. And there is no dagesh in the kof, and it's pronounced as a shevanah. But in Parashat Vayhi, it is pronounced ekevesus with a dagesh in it. Okay.